Welcome to Echo Shade, where history whispers its darkest secrets and forgotten stories.
Beauty is a fragile kingdom, one that can crown you, worship you, and in the same breath destroy you. And in the grand palaces of Europe, where portraits glowed under candlelight and emperors guarded their thrones with suspended breath, one woman rose like a myth. They called her the most beautiful empress Europe had ever seen, a title that glittered like diamonds and cut like them too. Her name would be engraved on coins, whispered in salons, painted by masters and carried across continents by diplomats and soldiers. But behind the soft glow of her ivory skin, behind the ocean-deep eyes that poets compared to the Aegean waves, behind the elegance that could silence entire courts, there lived a price no crown could pay, and no kingdom could shield. This is the story of that hidden cost. A star is born long before the name Empress followed her. She was simply Elisabeth, a girl born not in a palace, but in the sprawling, aging estate of a Bavarian ducal family. Her world was not polished marble halls, but wild forests, lakes shimmering in the morning sun, and horses with whom she spent more time than humans. That wildness, unpolished, untamed, would one day become the very reason an empire fell at her feet. Elisabeth, or Sisi as her family called her, she belonged to the world in a way girls of noble families rarely did. But fate has its own style of choosing queens. The day destiny shifted it was an ordinary morning when a letter arrived from the imperial court of Austria. Emperor Franz Joseph's mother, the Archduchess Sophie, wished for her son to meet Helene, the girl carefully raised, trained, and polished to perfection. A marriage, everyone assumed, was inevitable. So the Bavarian family packed their luggage, ironed their finest gowns, and prepared for Vienna. 14-year-old Sisi barely had time to braid her hair before being pulled onto the carriage. She wasn't the star of the trip after all. She was merely a shadow accompanying Helene. Had history obeyed its original script, Helene would have become Empress of Austria. But history loves rebels. The moment Franz Joseph laid eyes on Sisi, the world shifted. Courtiers saw it first, an unguarded moment where the emperor's breath simply stilled. Her beauty wasn't painted or practiced. It was natural, effortless, wild. Her innocence and her freedom radiated like something untouched by politics, etiquette, or ambition. Helene recited the lines she had memorized. Sisi nervously tugged at her gloves. Helene bowed flawlessly. Sisi stumbled, cheeks turning pink. Helene played the part of an empress. Sisi played none and won everything. Love, or something that looked like it. Franz Joseph's declaration stunned both families. Against his mother's wishes, against decades of imperial expectations, he chose Sisi, the wild girl, the unprepared girl. The girl who knew nothing of courts, diplomacy, or the suffocating world she was about to enter. It was romantic, the world said. A fairy tale, they whispered. But fairy tales are written by people who never saw the aftermath. Elisabeth married into not just a crown, but an empire built on unshakable traditions. Every detail of her life, her speech, her posture, her thoughts, would soon be monitored, corrected, rearranged. She was 18. The crown's first demand, perfection. The Viennese court was a place where beauty wasn't just admired. It was expected, measured, competed for. Every gown stitched had to be flawless. Every step taken had to be elegant. Every facial expression controlled. And yet Sisi did not struggle with this. She excelled. Her beauty wasn't just physical, it was magnetic. Her presence drew crowds. When she entered a ballroom, conversations paused. Ladies straightened their backs. Men forgot to blink. The attention was ablaze. Europe's most beautiful empress. It sounded like praise. It was a trap. Because suddenly, beauty was no longer a gift she possessed. It became a duty, a requirement, a cage, a burden she had to carry every day. The regime of perfection, Sisi, set a standard no one else in the empire could reach, not even herself. To protect her beauty, she built rituals that bordered on obsession. hours of exercise daily, a diet so strict it shook her ladies-in-waiting, hair care sessions that lasted 3 hours every morning. Measurements of her waist every day. A mirror in every corridor she walked. Her waist, famous across Europe, was achieved at a cost. She wore corsets pulled so tight that fainting became common. Even her horseback riding, her only true freedom, was pursued with a ferocity that frightened those around her. Her body was no longer hers. It was an artifact, maintained, preserved, displayed. For Europe, for her husband, for her title, for her myth. The mother-in-law who became a shadow. If beauty was the first demand, obedience was the second. The Archduchess Sophie believed Sisi was too soft, too emotional, too fragile to rule. So she took control. She took Sisi's children away from her. She dictated palace protocol. She monitored Sisi's schedule. She corrected her clothing, her grammar, her decisions. Sisi was an empress in name, but Sophie ruled the household. The loss of her children carved a wound so deep that even decades later, Sisi never fully recovered. Her daughter Sophie died as a baby during a journey, something the court blamed Sisi for. Her surviving daughter Gisela was raised not by her but by the Archduchess. Her son Rudolph, the heir, was treated like a possession of the empire rather than a child. Sisi learned early. Beauty could dazzle a court, but it could not protect a mother. The empire's golden cage there is a cruelty unique to palaces. The more beautiful the prisoner, the more admired the cage, 100-foot ceilings, chandeliers that glittered like fallen stars. Galleries lined with portraits of forgotten royals, marble floors so polished you could see your reflection. But there were no locks, because the walls themselves were the prison. Everyone admired her. No one knew her. Everyone wanted a piece of her image. No one wanted her truth. Everyone praised her grace. No one asked why she walked like someone carrying invisible weight. To the outside world, she was perfection. Inside, she was disappearing. A body everyone owned but her. As Sisi's beauty became legendary, something terrifying happened. Europe turned her into a symbol. Newspapers published every detail about her figure. Artists begged to paint her. Portraits of her hung in foreign embassies as tokens of Austrian power. Young girls starved themselves to imitate her tiny waist. Poets compared her to angels, Greek goddesses, celestial beings. Her face became Austria's brand, and whenever Sisi looked in a mirror, she saw not herself, but a version of her the world demanded she maintain. Is beauty still a gift when you no longer recognize the woman behind it? The escape into distance, unable to breathe under the weight of expectations, Sisi began to travel, obsessively. Greece, Switzerland, England, Hungary, Ireland, Madeira. She rode horses through English fields until her hands blistered. She climbed mountains just to feel her lungs burn. She learned languages, read philosophy, memorized poems. The farther she went from Vienna, the more she felt alive. But distance came with a price too. He could not understand her need to flee. Her son Rudolph grew up feeling abandoned, even though Sisi carried his image like a thorn in her heart. The court whispered that the Empress was unstable, strange, impossible to control. But Sisi wasn't unstable, she was suffocating. And suffocation looks like madness when witnessed from the outside. The weight of a nation's fantasy for Europe, she was a dream. For Austria, she was a symbol. For her husband, she was a fragile, beloved wife he couldn't reach. For her children, she was a ghost drifting at the edges of their childhood. But for herself, she didn't know who she was. Every portrait of her was flawless. Every painting added another layer of armor to the myth. And myths cannot breathe. The hidden cost of beauty wasn't just physical exhaustion. It was identity loss. It was emotional exile. It was being loved by millions yet understood by none. The seeds of tragedy. By the time the world crowned her Europe's most beautiful empress, she had already paid the price. A childhood sacrificed, a marriage strained, children distanced from her. her health deteriorating, her mind sinking into shadows. But the world didn't see the cracks. They only saw the crown, and the beautiful thing about crowns is that they hide fractures perfectly. Until the day everything shatters, the world saw Sisi as a shimmering symbol, beauty carved into human form, grace draped in silk. But beneath the jewels, beneath the golden crown, beneath the flawlessly painted portraits, there was a woman trying desperately to outrun a life she never asked for. And with every year, the weight of that crown increased. Because now, her beauty was no longer simply admired. It was political. The empire was in turmoil. Nations within Austria-Hungary were tense, resentful, demanding change. And suddenly the court realized something Sisi had never understood. Her beauty, her charm, her almost mythical aura was a weapon. A weapon the empire wanted to use. The Hungarian connection, Hungary, proud, fiery, independent, had long chafed under Austrian rule. Revolts, rebellions, bloodshed, the tension between Vienna and Budapest had been simmering for decades. But when Sisi first visited Hungary, something unexpected happened. The Hungarian people fell in love with her. Not the way Vienna loved her, a cold admiration wrapped in etiquette. No, Hungarians adored her as something real. They saw her spirit, her wildness, her refusal to be confined. To them, she wasn't an empress. She was a queen of the heart. They lined the roads, shouting her name. They brought flowers. Women copied her dresses. Men bowed with genuine affection, not formality. Sisi felt something she had not felt in Vienna. She felt seen, and Hungary became the second half of her soul. A queen is born. Her affection for the Hungarian people wasn't political. At least not at first. But it soon became that. Because when Franz Joseph saw how Hungary adored his wife, he realized that her influence could finally heal an empire breaking at the seams. And so, Sisi stepped into politics, not because she loved power, but because she loved Hungary, loved the freedom she felt riding across its plains, loved the people who smiled at her without judgment. She became their advocate, their voice in the court, their shield against the hard-fisted Austrian ministers who saw Hungary as troublesome. She negotiated, persuaded, insisted, and even fought with courtiers who underestimated her. They were wrong. Her beauty opened the doors. Her intelligence kept them open. And in 1867, Hungary gained what it had long dreamed of. Autonomy. It was Sisi's greatest political victory. And on that day, she was crowned Queen of Hungary, a title she held closer to her heart than Empress of Austria. Hungary loved her, and she loved Hungary back with equal fierceness. But power has a price. You don't enter politics without making enemies. Vienna's aristocrats resented her. The older generation of royal advisors despised her influence. Archduchess Sophie, her mother-in-law, saw it as another failure of her authority. Behind closed doors, they whispered, "She uses her beauty to manipulate. She is unstable. She is too emotional for politics. She is a danger to the empire." But the truth was harder for them to accept. Sisi wasn't emotional. She was empathetic. She wasn't weak. She was human. She wasn't manipulative. She was persuasive. Her beauty may have brought her into the room, but her heart made her unforgettable. Still, whispers can destroy even the strongest spirits, and Sisi's spirit was already cracked. The return of old wounds, her children, raised not by her, but by the iron hand of Archduchess Sophie, were now growing. Her daughter Gisela was dutiful, calm, disciplined, everything the court wanted. But Sisi saw in her a distance she couldn't bridge. The girl had learned obedience rather than love, formality instead of affection. But her son Rudolf was different. He was brilliant, sensitive, curious, everything Sisi once was. He adored nature. He read books forbidden by the court. He questioned tradition. He thought beyond the empire's rigid borders. Sisi recognized something frighteningly familiar in him, soul that didn't fit the cage it was raised in. Vienna tried to crush that spirit. Tutors bullied him. Officers hardened him. His father expected him to become a soldier without fear, a prince without doubt, an heir without flaws. But Rudolf was none of those things. He was his mother's child. And just like Sisi suffered under the weight of the crown, Rudolf began to crumble under it too. Sisi watched helplessly as history repeated itself. A mother's heartbreak. By the time Rudolf reached adolescence, he was already breaking. He trembled under discipline. He cried after inspections. He was terrified of the military, yet forced into it. Sisi begged Franz Joseph to ease the pressure on their son. Franz Joseph, loyal to tradition and duty, refused. He is the future emperor. He must be strong. But strength meant something different in the court. Strength meant suppression. Strength meant silence. Silence. Strength meant erasing every softness. Sisi saw Rudolf losing the light in his eyes, the same light she had lost years before. She made a decision, a bold one, a forbidden one. She took control of his upbringing. Not fully, but enough to give him space to breathe. She brought tutors who encouraged intellectual exploration, who valued imagination, who nurtured rather than punished. It was a small victory, but victories in palaces are always temporary. The paper crown while Europe adored Sisi. Inside the palace, she became a ghost. Her influence, though powerful, came at a cost. She was watched more closely, criticized more harshly, judged more cruelly. And slowly, she withdrew again. Vienna suffocated her. Budapest revived her. Her son's suffering consumed her. The court's politics drained her. And then came the obsession that would define the next decade of her life. The preservation of beauty. The tyranny of the mirror the world expected her to remain eternally perfect. And Sisi tried. Every year, her beauty rituals intensified. She stopped eating solid food for long periods. She drank raw meat juice for her strength. She weighed herself daily and panicked if she gained even a few ounces. Her hair, no, so long it touched the floor, was washed with eau de cologne and eggs for hours at a time. She spent mornings tightening corsets until she could barely breathe. She forced her lady-in-waiting to measure her waist obsessively, 19 inches, 18, sometimes 17. Her body was no longer herself. It was a sculpture she was determined to preserve against time. But time always wins, and Sisi knew it. Which is why her obsession was not vanity. It was fear. Fear that if her beauty faded, her only value in the empire would disappear with it. Fear that without beauty, she would be nothing more than a political inconvenience, a useless emblem, a woman who never wanted this life in the first place. Fear that she would fade, as she felt her soul already had. The escape into distance, again her travels became more frequent, more desperate. Whenever the palace grew too heavy, whenever her reflection felt too foreign, whenever her heart trembled with the weight of expectations and grief, she fled. To Switzerland's quiet lakes, to the Mediterranean's warm winds, to Greece's ancient ruins, to Ireland's hunting fields, to England's countryside. People saw her as restless, but she wasn't restless. She was searching for something, a piece of herself. She had lost the day she married. And the day she married. Her letters during this time reveal a haunting truth. I feel like a bird that was born to fly, but had its wings clipped by fate. The Empress who couldn't be held, the more Sisi distanced herself from Vienna, the more people wanted her. Crowds waited for a glimpse of her. Newspapers wrote about her gowns. Artists painted her without ever seeing her. She became an icon, a legend, a ghostly beauty rarely seen but always spoken about. The fewer public appearances she made, the more valuable each one became. And every time she showed her face, the world gasped. She still looked like a young woman. Her waist still impossibly thin. Her posture still regal. Her eyes still deep and haunting. But what the world never saw was how much it cost her to maintain that illusion. Beauty had become a battlefield, and she was the first casualty. The fragile heart of an empress as Sisi aged, she grew more isolated. The court considered her strange. The emperor loved her, but never understood her. Her daughters became distant. Her son Rudolph became troubled. The people adored her. The palace tolerated her. Her family barely reached her. She had everything, and yet she had nothing. The greatest tragedy of her life was not her beauty, but the price she paid for it. The shattering of Rudolph, and then it happened. The turning point. The moment everything cracked. The wound that would never heal. Rudolph, now crown prince, now a man burdened with duty he never wanted, fell into a deep depression. He drank too much. He read dark philosophy. He felt chained by the empire. He fought with his father. He felt unloved, misunderstood, suffocated, just like his mother. Sisi saw it. She felt it. She felt it. But she could not save him, because the empire that shaped him was the same empire that destroyed her. Mother and son were two souls sinking in the same storm, reaching for each other but never close enough to grasp. This storm would eventually lead to the tragedy at Mayerling, but that is part 3. The mask of an empress in public, she still glowed. In portraits, she still looked timeless. In newspapers, she was still the most beautiful woman of her age. But behind closed doors, she slept little. She walked endlessly, sometimes for 8 hours. She refused photographs as she aged. She wore heavy veils to hide her face. She wrote poetry filled with grief and longing. She traveled with no fixed home, no fixed purpose, just movement. Movement was her only freedom. Standing still meant feeling the pain. The world that adored her never knew her by now. Her legend was unstoppable. Women wanted her beauty. Men wanted her presence. Poets wanted her sadness. Politicians wanted her influence. And yet, she had lost her childhood. She had lost her freedom. She had lost her identity. She had lost control of her life. She had lost her relationship with her children. She would soon lose her son entirely. This was the hidden cost of being the most beautiful empress in Europe. Everyone loved the idea of her. No one loved her. The beginning of the end by the late 1880s, sadness clung to Sisi like a shadow that never left her side. She wore only black. She spoke less. She smiled rarely. She avoided mirrors. She wrote poems about death and emptiness. Not because she hated life, but because she felt life had left her behind long ago. Every tragedy of her past, every expectation of her present, every fear of her future, pressed against her chest like a weight she could no longer lift. She was an empress surrounded by admirers, yet profoundly alone. The deeper Sisi traveled into her life, the darker the world became around her. Vienna's glittering palaces couldn't hide the shadows anymore. Her beauty, once her armor, had thinned. Her travels, once her escape, had become her exile. And the son she adored, the only soul who shared the same wounds, was slipping from her grasp. This is the part of the story where tragedy stops whispering and begins to scream. The fragile Prince Rudolph grew up in the same cage Sisi did, rigid, unyielding, suffocating. Just like his mother, he had a gentle heart in a brutal world. And the empire did what empires do best. It punished softness. Rudolph was intelligent, sensitive, thoughtful. A man born centuries ahead of his time. He read forbidden authors. He questioned monarchy. He believed in democracy. He refused blind obedience. To Vienna, this was not brilliance. This was rebellion. Franz Joseph, raised on tradition and iron discipline, believed his son needed to be molded into an emperor of steel. But steel cracks when bent too far. Rudolph began losing himself. He drank heavily. He argued with the court. He found solace in dangerous circles. He fell into depression that ate him from within. And through all of it, Sisi watched with the helpless sorrow only a mother knows. The sorrow of seeing your own pain reflected in your child. The distance between them, Sisi loved her son fiercely, but their lives were broken in similar ways. Both were chained by expectations. Both suffocated under the weight of duty. Both fled the court whenever they could. Both felt misunderstood by the emperor. Both longed for freedom. But mother and son shared something even more tragic. They both believed they were alone. Rudolph thought Sisi was too consumed by her own sadness to save him. Sisi thought Rudolph would resent her if she tried to pull him closer. And Franz Joseph, stern, traditional, painfully unaware, never understood either of them. It was a triangle destined for heartbreak. The final days before the storm in his early 30s, Rudolph reached his breaking point. He wrote desperate letters to Sisi, letters filled with darkness, hopelessness, and despair. He begged her for emotional support. He begged his father for freedom. He begged the empire for understanding. He received none. The court hushed his struggles. The emperor dismissed his pleas. Society mocked his politics. The palace demanded perfection, and slowly he sank, and sank, and sank, and sank. Sisi saw it happening, but even she didn't know how deep the darkness went. Because Rudolph hid his pain behind charm, wit, and the same forced smile that Sisi had used her entire life. He learned from the best. The girl who walked into a tragedy then came Baroness Mary Witzera, a young woman barely 17. Beautiful, naive, and dangerously infatuated with the crown prince, to Rudolph she represented escape. Not love, but release. Not passion, but surrender. Not romance, but the shared fantasy of ending pain. Mary believed she was joining Rudolph in a fairy tale romance. What she was actually entering was the darkest chapter in Habsburg history. The road to Mayerling, January 1889. Winter pressed over Austria like a death shroud. Rudolph retreated to his private hunting lodge in Mayerling, a place surrounded by forests, far from Vienna, far from judgment, far from the suffocating world of duty. Mary joined him soon. Sisi was thousands of miles away when it happened, traveling as usual, unable to sit still in Vienna's suffocating atmosphere. She didn't know the storm had reached its final moment. She didn't know that history was about to split open. She didn't know she was about to lose the last piece of her soul. The night the Empire broke, the exact details of that night were buried, manipulated, softened for public consumption. But history agrees on one thing. Rudolph was desperate, broken, at the end of his strength. And on that cold January night, Rudolph and Mary made a pact. Tragic, irreversible, final. What happened next ended two lives and shattered one. A single gunshot, and another. By morning, the Empire's heir was dead. The crown's future had vanished. A 17-year-old girl had paid the price for someone else's despair. And the Habsburg dynasty cracked in a way it would never recover from. The message that found Sisi the news was delivered to Sisi quietly, carefully, almost tremblingly. They knew her fragility. They feared what would happen when they told her. But nothing could prepare her, not for this. The moment the words reached her, everything inside her collapsed. People recalled that she didn't scream, she didn't faint, she didn't speak. She simply froze. A silence so deep fell over her that even those around her were afraid to breathe. Then she whispered, "My Rudolph, my poor Rudolph. He was always alone." That was all she said. And then she aged 20 years in a single day. The mother who could not save her son Sisi blamed herself. Of course she did. She blamed herself for every mile she'd traveled away from Vienna. For every moment she wasn't there to protect him. For every shadow she passed on to him. For giving him her spirit, the same spirit the world tried to break. For not fighting the court harder. For not seeing the signs clearly. For not reaching him in time. Her grief was so vast it swallowed her whole. Nothing, not Hungary, not travel, not poetry, not beauty rituals, could save her now. The Empress, who feared emotional closeness, felt a loneliness no language could capture. The world watched the Empress fade at the funeral. Sisi stood like a statue carved from sorrow. Her face veiled, her eyes hollow, her body trembling beneath layers of black silk. Rudolph lay in an imperial coffin adorned with gold. surrounded by generals, bishops, and foreign dignitaries. But to Sisi, he was still the little boy who once reached for a hand, the child who asked her questions about stars, the boy who wanted nothing more than to be understood. And she had failed him. Every step she took away from the bier echoed with guilt. From that day, she no longer lived. She survived. A small difference for most. A vast difference for her. The man who lost both his son and his wife, Franz Joseph's grief, was monumental too. But he hid it behind the same stoic discipline he carried all his life. Losing his son crushed him, but losing Sisi crushed him more. Because after Mayerling, Sisi was gone, physically. She still walked through the palace, traveled the world, breathed the same air. But her soul was somewhere else, somewhere unreachable, somewhere dark. Franz Joseph would later say, "It was after Mayerling that I truly lost my wife." He was right. The Empress who walks in black Sisi abandoned color, forever. Black dresses, black veils, black gloves, black umbrellas, black hats. She wandered through palaces like a living shadow. Courtiers stepped aside when they heard her faint footsteps in the hallway. She rarely spoke. She rarely ate. She rarely allowed anyone to see her face. She wrote in her diary, "I want to vanish, into the sea, into wind, into death. Anywhere but here." Her beauty, once her crown, was now her tormentor. The world still wanted to see the legendary Empress, but Sisi refused to be seen. She hid behind veils so thick that even her own family could not make out her expression. The most beautiful woman in Europe no longer wanted to exist. The escape that never-ended travel became her only relief. But now it wasn't adventure. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't freedom. It was running. Running from memories, running from guilt, running from mirrors, running from herself. She lived out of suitcases, changed hotels constantly, walked endlessly for miles until her shoes tore, kept moving because stillness meant facing the pain. She refused security guards. She refused carriages. She refused attention. It is better if no one notices me anymore. This was her new creed. The Empress who once outran expectations was now outrunning grief. The body that carried too much sorrow, her health deteriorated sharply. She fainted often. Her appetite vanished completely. Her weight dropped dangerously low. She walked so much her bones ached. Her insomnia became constant. Her heart, always delicate, weakened. Doctors begged her to rest. She refused. "Rest is death," she said. But grief is heavier than any crown. And it was crushing her from the inside. The last illusions of beauty, even in her brokenness, Sisi still clung to one thing, the illusion of beauty. She would not allow anyone to photograph her again. She refused painters. She refused public appearances. She refused festivals, balls, ceremonies. Her own people began to forget her face. Letters from the time describe her as a veiled woman, a ghost, a shadow passing through Europe. The world remembered her as a legend of beauty, but the woman behind the legend had died long before her body would. A Cor's ghost, she spent her last years drifting like a soul without a home. Sometimes she was in Switzerland, sometimes in France, sometimes in Italy, and she spoke of Rudolph constantly as if he were simply traveling far away and would return someday. But she knew he wouldn't. She knew she had already lived past the point where life had meaning, and yet she lived on, because fate had one last chapter to write. One last cost for Europe's most beautiful empress to pay. And that chapter would come suddenly, violently, unexpectedly. At the shores of Lake Geneva, the winter of 1896 hung over Europe like a tired sun. In Vienna, the palace corridors glowed with warm lamplight, but inside Empress Elisabeth's heart, the cold had only deepened. People still called her the most beautiful woman in Europe, an eternal spring wrapped in silk. But the truth was far quieter, far more fragile. Every year, beauty felt less like a gift and more like a shackle welded around her ribs. Court painters exaggerated her radiance. Newspapers adored her silhouette. Poets praised her swan-like neck, and the waterfall of chestnut hair she protected with almost religious devotion. But beauty had stopped being hers a long time ago. It belonged to the public, to the empire, to expectations, to history. And expectations were heavy. She had given the world the illusion of an immortal empress, but inside, she was dissolving. She was dissolving. The grief of her son Rudolph's death had drained the world of all color. The palace mirrors reflected a face that pretended to be calm, but behind her eyes lived a permanent storm, an exhaustion that even the sea winds of Corfu or the mountain air of Switzerland could not silence. So she walked, endlessly walked, miles a day, sometimes more than soldiers could endure. It was the only thing that kept her heartbeat steady, the only ritual that convinced her body she had not collapsed under the weight she carried alone. The world saw an empress on holiday, but she was running from memories, from guilt, from the crushing expectations of a throne she had never wanted. And she never stopped running until the day the world caught up to her. The final journey in September 1898, Europe glittered with late summer vibrance. Geneva, a peaceful city of lakes and mountains, offered her the anonymity she craved. For once, she registered under a false name, Countess of Hohenems. She wanted no carriages, no ladies-in-waiting, no ceremonial gods, just her lady friend, Irma, and the freedom to walk without being recognized, even if it was a freedom she could hold only for a few hours. The streets smelled of warm sugar, lake air, and the distant sound of boat horns. She wore a simple black dress, tightly laced at the waist, her parasol tilted slightly forward, hiding her face. Not an empress today, just a woman passing through, but fate was waiting for her at the shore. The Italian anarchist Luigi Lucchini had come to Geneva searching for any royal victim, any symbol of a world he despised. He didn't even expect to find the Empress of Austria-Hungary. He didn't know she was in Geneva, but newspapers carelessly leaked her presence that morning. Enemies of the crown didn't just watch kings, they watched gossip, and gossip betrayed her. The moment the world stopped, Elisabeth and Irma arrived at the harbor, ready to board the steamship Geneva. The pier was crowded, lively, the lake glittering a soft blue. Nobody paid attention to the two women in plain black clothing, except one man. Lucchini waited under a shade by the pier, pretending to adjust his boot. His hand shook lightly, not from fear, but from a feverish mix of rage and purpose. He didn't have a gun, didn't need. In his pocket was a sharpened needle file, thin like a dagger, easy to conceal, easy to justify as a tool. He told himself he was not killing a person. He was killing a symbol. Elisabeth walked gracefully toward the gangplank, unaware that each soft step carried her toward the end of a life already too heavy to bear. Irma chatted gently beside her, telling her the schedule for the afternoon. Elisabeth nodded, smiling faintly, but her eyes remained on the water, calm, wide, endless. The one place she always believed her heart belonged. She did not see Lucchini approach. He moved fast, too fast for Irma to react. In a single violent motion, he drove the sharpened file into her chest just above her heart. The impact was so swift, so sharp, that Elisabeth staggered, gasped, then regained her balance. For a moment, she believed he had only pushed her. The crowd froze. Irma screamed. The attacker fled. But Elisabeth, trembling, insisted they continue walking. They had a ship to catch, she said. She did not want a scene. She did not want headlines. She wanted silence, one last moment of dignity. So they walked, even as her heart bled inside her. The fall of an empress on board the ship. Her breathing became shallow. Her gloved hand pressed against her chest, and when she pulled it back, there were spots of blood on the lace. The world swayed. Her vision blurred. She collapsed. The sailors rushed her back to the Hotel Beau Rivage. They carried her upstairs, laid her on her bed, unfastened her corset, and then the truth appeared. A deep puncture wound over her heart. The weapon had pierced her pericardium, her life was slipping away quietly, the same way she had always tried to live. She whispered one last sentence, barely audible. "Irma, what has happened to me?" Within minutes, her pulse faded. The woman Europe called immortal, the beauty that poets swore would never die, went still as the lamps flickered in the quiet room. At 2:40 p.m., Empress Elisabeth of Austria, Sisi, was pronounced dead. News spread like lightning across the continent. Vienna's bells tolled with heavy dread. Crowds gathered outside palaces, mourning a woman they had never truly known. Some cried for an empress, some cried for a legend. Some cried for the tragic, broken beauty whose sorrow had been hidden behind diamonds, but very few cried for Elisabeth the woman, because so few had ever seen her. The world she left behind her death shattered Emperor Franz Joseph. The man who had adored her from the moment she walked into his life now stood over her coffin like a shadow of himself. His beard trembled, his eyes hollow. He had lost her long before this date, lost her to grief, to the wild freedom she chased across Europe, to the weight of her own untold suffering. But this was final, irreversible. He whispered to her in the candlelit hall, "You were the only joy in my life." At the funeral, her coffin was draped in black. Her crown and scepter rested beside her, symbols of a duty that had never fit the shape of her heart. Crowds pressed against the gates, more than she had ever wanted, yet somehow exactly what history demanded. In the twilight glow of the imperial chapel, her legacy began to shift. She was no longer just the beautiful empress. She became a martyr of royalty, a symbol of the hidden cost of crowns, of a life lost between duty and desire. But if there was one truth that lived beyond her grave, it was this: beauty had been her curse. Freedom had been her dream, and grief had been her companion. History immortalized her face, her figure, her elegance. But behind every portrait was a woman who never stopped mourning, never stopped walking, and never stopped searching for a life that wasn't her. The empire after her death, Franz Joseph became quieter, older. He continued ruling with determination, but the spark she had once gifted him, the youthful energy she brought to the throne, never returned. He often visited her portrait in the Habsburg, touching the frame lightly, lost in memories only he could feel. Rudolph's empty rooms remained untouched. Elisabeth's writing desk remained open. Her diaries were sealed, her poems locked away. History would not read them for 60 years. When they were finally revealed, Europe gasped, not because they were political, but because they were heartbreakingly human. She wrote of loneliness, of a cage made of gold, of a life that did not belong to her, of the fear of fading beauty, of the longing for escape. She had been loved by millions, yet understood by very few. The true cost generations later, people still visit her palace rooms, her dresses, her portraits, her famous hair ornaments shaped like stars. Tourists still whisper about her beauty, her waistline, her fashion, her elegance. But beauty is only the first page of her story. The rest is made of loss, sacrifice, rebellion, and a desperate search for identity inside a world that refused to see her as anything other than an empress. Her life was a fairy tale from afar, but from within it was a storm. She will forever be remembered as Europe's most beautiful empress, not because of how she looked, but because of how deeply she struggled beneath the surface. Her tragedy wasn't her fame. Her tragedy was her silence. And in that silence lived the hidden cost.